Hey everybody, welcome to today's show. I am your host, Sam Carey. This is the new EdTech Classroom Live. We go live on YouTube, Facebook, and Periscope every Thursday at 4 p.m. And one of the benefits of coming to a live show is that you can put your questions in the comments, and I will try my best to pull them in and answer them throughout the show. Today's show is going to be about blended learning strategies. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Before we get started, do just want to make a couple of quick announcements. So first announcement is that on Sunday, I put out a video on my channel. This video is called Top Tech Tools for Teachers in 2021. If you have not yet checked out that video, there is a link in the video description for this show. And the reason I bring it up is because some of the programs that are shown in that video would be really useful if you are in need of some blended learning programs. So there are several programs in that video that I haven't covered yet on my channel that I highly recommend, and you should definitely check it out. And another announcement that I'm excited about is that I have partnered with the Bureau of Education and Research to host an all-day workshop about increasing student learning with education technology. And there are going to be 2 full-day workshops in April and 2 full-day workshops in May. There's information about those workshops in the video description. The dates are April 4th and 5th and May 3rd and May 4th. And those are also workshops that you can get professional development credit for, as well as continuing education credits. So definitely check that out. I would love to see you at those workshops. And then also just want to invite everybody to click on the link in the video description to join my mailing list. I send out a weekly newsletter, and in that newsletter, there are updates about news that's going on. If I've been, say, featured in an article or have any upcoming events, we'll send those out in the newsletter. And then you also hear about course reopenings and whether or not we've published a tutorial, upcoming live shows, things like that. So please join the mailing list if you would like to get that newsletter. And as a bonus, you also get immediate access to over 20 free resources that you can use in your classroom, hyperdocs, graphic organizers, all kinds of stuff like that. So check that out as well. Now, lastly, just want to give a big shout out to today's show sponsor, Restream. Thank you so much, Restream, for helping make these live shows possible. I'm actually streaming right now with Restream. Restream is the streaming software that allows me to stream out to multiple places at once. And one of the things I really love about it is that it pulls in everybody's comments from all those different platforms. I can see them all at the same place. So if you are interested in streaming, definitely check out Restream. There's also a link in the video description. And you can personally show your support for the work I do on this channel by just hitting the like button, by leaving comments on the video, and also, of course, subscribing to my channel and sharing the video with other teachers that you know if you find the tips in this video helpful. All right, so let's get into talking about blended learning strategies. And I in the fall, put out a video, and this video was about blended learning tips. And I put out this video because I say the fall, but it was the summer. I put out the video because at the time it looked like a lot of schools were going to be moving into this model of blended learning. Now, what blended learning meant at that time for a lot of schools was that they were going to do half and half. So they were going to have half the kids come in for half of the days of the week and do a split where those other half came in for another half of the week. And then other students were going to be doing this asynchronous learning at home. So the tips that I shared in that video, I'm going to share again here. They do still apply, but I know that a lot of us are facing a different situation right now. So there's a lot of people out there right now who are needing to do concurrent blended learning, where you actually have students physically in a classroom, and then you also have students who are attending class, but they're attending that class virtually. I actually volunteer in a makerspace class that is like that, and have been doing that for quite a while now. And I have been getting a lot of questions about how do you address that particular issue. So this show is really going to be focused on that question. How do we implement blended learning when we have some students who are physically in the classroom and we have students who are coming into the class, but they're virtual and we have to teach them at the same time? Now, I know this is something that is stressing people out, rightfully so. I do think, however, that there are some really clear, tangible things that we can do that don't have to involve buying a bunch of extra equipment and wearing a lapel mic and doing all kinds of things that would be really involved and potentially expensive. We can still use a lot of the same techniques and strategies that I already talk about on this channel, in my show, and all my tutorials with technology integration. I'm going to show in this show different examples of how you might organize groups, how you might organize your classroom, and different ways that you could think about how you could approach this question. All right. So yeah, I'd love to hear people already putting in the chat whether or not you are facing this situation. So I would love to hear that. And actually that can help. I can even talk to some specific situations throughout the show. Are you hybrid? Are you doing concurrent hybrid right now? Are you fully remote? Are you fully in person? That would be great to hear from people just so I can see what's going on in different people's classrooms. Okay, so in the video that I mentioned, I did give 5 tips, and those 5 tips still apply. So I want to just mention them very briefly before we get into the show today. And the first tip that I gave in that video was to post everything to your learning management system. So this is very important because essentially you're digitizing your curriculum, you're making it accessible so that a student's ability to access information is not dependent on them physically being in class. They can still predictably access anything by going to your learning management system. And the next is to prepare to flip your instruction. Now, I'm going to be talking more about flipped instruction in this show today, but the general idea with flipping instruction is that students are learning independently, asynchronously, and it actually doesn't have to necessarily mean at home. This could be happening in class, but they're learning through other mechanisms than, say, you just giving direct instruction. That might be watching a video tutorial that you've made. It might mean going through and watching some interactive videos, reading interactive articles, going through a hyperdoc that you've constructed, so that you're going to open up your time by doing that to be able to do other types of activities. So we'll be talking about that and what that might look like today. And the third tip was to ensure that all of your lessons, particularly your synchronous lessons, are interactive. I'll be showing a couple of examples of this today. This is really where you're going to make sure that you meet the students who are coming in remotely where they're at, and you give them an equitable learning experience so that whatever they're doing on their device is exactly the same as what every other student is doing on their device as well. And they can participate just as equally as anybody else in class because you've made all of your lessons interactive. The fourth tip, which we'll also talk about today, was to focus on lesson design. And I say focus on lesson design as opposed to lesson delivery. And so what I mean by that is there's a bigger emphasis on planning up front. So you might be constructing a hyperdoc that is well thought through, that a student could potentially do on their own in a self-paced lesson. There's more planning up front, more thought that has to go into the planning, but then in class, you're freeing up your time, making yourself more flexible, and we'll look at some models for what that would look like. And then my last tip in that video was to ensure that you're also teaching tech skills and embedding some tech skills instruction into your lessons so that the technology doesn't become a barrier. What you don't want to find is that the students, particularly if they're remote, are unable to move forward because they didn't know how to do a particular thing or action that you were asking them to do on the computer. So it's important that we're really thinking through what technology skills will a student need in order to access a particular part of this lesson and make sure we're embedding that into our instruction. So these tips still apply, but I know that there are different challenges that come up when we have computers in the room with students on those computers and physical students in the room. That's kind of a different situation. Hybrid learning and hybrid teaching has been around for a while, but that is something that's different and relatively unique to this situation. And yeah, I'm looking through the comments now, and it looks like there are a lot of people who are in that situation as well, where they're doing some simultaneous remote and in-person teaching, also some fully remote. And even if you're fully remote right now, a lot of the techniques that I'm going to talk about, even the ways that I'm talking about organizing your day, would still apply. So that will still be helpful for you. Okay, let's get into talking about a few different models of instruction. So I'm going to emphasize 3 different models of instruction. And some of this work is based on some of Caitlin Tucker's work on blended learning. If you're not familiar with her, definitely check her out. She's a leading thinker on how to create effective blending learning environments, has written a couple of books about them. And I really like the way that she talks about thinking about planning your day. And so I'm going to use some of her language in this show. And so one of the ways that she talks about planning instruction is with the term vertical planning. Now, vertical planning is a type of planning that is perhaps more traditional instruction, where we would have students proceed essentially linearly through a lesson. So we might have something, for example, like a do now, then we would provide direct instruction to students. We would have them engage in some kind of whole group practice and then do some independent practice, move into an exit ticket. Now, I know that a lot of people are trying to kind of mimic this model of instruction when doing hybrid teaching, and they're having some difficulty with it. It's turning into, some people trying to live stream teaching, hooking themselves up with a mic so they can do a lot of live instruction. Now, we're going to talk about a different model, but in a moment. But there are some ways that we can still take this model and just make it into a more effective means of teaching students if we're doing this strange kind of hybrid model of kids coming in on the computer, which I've represented here with the kid's torso sticking out of the computer. That means that the student is remote, whereas these are the physical students in person. So in this particular model, if you want to continue this means of instruction, this model of instruction where you're really vertical planning, your vertical teaching, then that's really going to be dependent on having one-on-one devices. So you're going to still want to have every student on a computer. And this is where having those interactive lessons is going to be really important. Now, a program I know that a lot of people are familiar with and have probably used a lot in this past year is Nearpod. Nearpod is effective for that. So, essentially what you would be doing in a Nearpod lesson, you would be having all the students participate at the same time. So you would launch this as a live lesson. Doesn't matter if a student is remote, doesn't matter if the student is physically in person, they're still going to be able to participate, to answer these questions, to take the polls, to do the different activities in a Nearpod lesson. Now, Nearpod is awesome, but Nearpod also has certain limitations. For example, it's not always the best for being able to really give feedback to students and being able to get a clear window into what they're doing. So there are some other programs that you might want to look at that are going to essentially create digital workspaces for students. And again, it doesn't matter whether or not the student is remote or in person, they still would have the digital workspace in front of them. You as the teacher can be in class observing those digital workspaces. ClassKick will allow you to do this. Formative, Whiteboard Fi, and a program that is in that video that I referred to, the top tech tools for teachers in 2021, is Whiteboard Chat. I'm going to show Whiteboard Chat right now because what I like about Whiteboard Chat is the fact that it is kind of absorbed a lot of the different feature deficiencies, or I should say it has addressed a lot of the feature deficiencies of other online whiteboard programs, other online whiteboard space programs, and it's built them into their platform, and it's also 100% free. So Whiteboard chat will allow you to build essentially lessons within a whiteboard, but it also doesn't limit you to a single page. So if we're kind of thinking here, for example, again, about our vertical planning, what we can do is pre-build a lesson in whiteboard chat. So we can ask students to do things like, let's say, for example, this was a lesson about summarizing and learning how to write an effective summary. We have a do now question that they're all going to do at the same time, where they're going to be describing their favorite movie in 10 words or less, see how they can do. We're going to have a discussion about that, post an image about their movie. And then I'm basically going to proceed through a lesson with them. So I have some of this pre-set up. I'm going to be live doing some direct instruction here where I will be writing out some steps and doing some modeling, filling in a graphic organizer, showing how I would fill in the main idea of my own favorite movie, some key details, and then I could do a model summary in front of them. So again, just following that sort of linear path of direct instruction where the students are just observing essentially what I'm doing. Then we could have an activity where students are going to watch this video, which I love teaching this true story of the three little pigs told from the wolf perspective. And then they're going to practice now applying this, right, where they're going to do the main idea, key details, and then on the next page, they will apply that learning by writing a summary, right? So you can imagine I'm essentially walking them through this. They're doing this all at the same time. So we are all doing the same parts of the lesson together. Now, a couple things that I want to show you about this program. So this is a student account, and you can see here, for example, when a student does something like adds some text. So let's just say, for example, that they start writing my favorite movie. And as the teacher now, when I go back to the teacher end, I can go to grid view, and this is going to allow me to see all of the students' workspaces here. So you can see here, this is my demo student. You can imagine I have all of my kids. I'm, at potentially my desk or at my teacher stand, and I can see everybody's workspaces. It doesn't matter if they're remote. It doesn't matter if they're in person. I can click on those workspaces. We can showcase them. So the showcase is going to push that board out to all student devices so that students could see that as a model or for a means of discussion. And one thing I really like about this program is that you can also join those whiteboards. So I can actually get in, I can join the student's whiteboard. I can see the work that they are doing in there, as they are doing the next parts as well. I can see that work that they're doing and I can give them feedback. And with this program, you can give them feedback in all kinds of ways. You can even record a video of yourself through your webcam, leaving them feedback. You can, obviously very quickly just leave them a little piece of text feedback on here as well. But it's just a really effective tool for being able to see what students are doing on their screens. And it has all these other functions that I really like the ability to do things like freeze the board and things like that that are really useful. So definitely recommend that. Let's see, here I am. Where am I? Okay. So definitely recommend that you check out this program. And again, this concept is really important when we're thinking about how to create an equitable space so that it doesn't matter if the student is coming in remotely. It doesn't matter if they are in person. I can still see all the work that they are doing on that grid view, and I can still jump in, I can still give them support, and we can actually pace this lesson all together at the same pace. So that's one way to do it. You can continue the model of vertical planning by using these programs that give you these virtual workspaces. Now, that's going to work for some lessons, but we are also going to need to start thinking a little bit outside the box about how we organize our lessons in order to really make this effective, right? So got the logo up there. Actually, I have my little Canva logo up there. Canva is also an awesome program that I'll talk about in a moment. That could help out as well. So I will talk about that actually later. So another idea that that Catlin Tucker talks about is how to shift away from vertical instruction and instead start looking at how we can plan horizontally and do stations-based instruction. So I'm going to show some examples of this in a moment so that we can see exactly kind of what this means and what this would look like. But the basic idea is that we would still have a whole group check-in at the beginning of class. This could be a do now, it could be a kickoff where you're giving an explanation of the learning objectives for the day and perhaps talking about what the final outcome is going to be. But then students move into stations. And I'll talk about how you could potentially group these in a moment. Stations in this model are essentially flat. So they're no longer dependent on linear progress. So whereas in this model, in order to do the group practice, you really needed to have had the direct instruction. You can't do the independent practice without having the preceding activities. In this model, you're going to set up different activities that could happen at the same time, and it doesn't matter the order in which they take place. You can follow up your stations-based activities with independent work, with collaborative work, and then you can close out class again by coming all back together with a whole group checkout. Now, when you're thinking about organizing stations, and actually I would love to hear in the comments if people have done stations before, if this is a model that you're familiar with, if you've used stations in your class, if you've been trying this out already, that would be great to hear. I want to give some ideas here for how we might think about organizing groups for stations-based learning. So one possibility is that you essentially create homogeneous groups where you're going to have groups of students who are remote, and then you're going to have groups of students who are in person. Okay, that's one option. Another option is that you are going to have groups of students where you actually have some students who are physically in the class, and then they're joined by their peers who are on the computer, right? And another that might need to happen if you have to do social distancing and you actually cannot have students in groups, you're not allowed to do it, is that you still do stations rotations, but you do them with individual students. And I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. And so each of these are different possibilities for how you could combine students. And then as the teacher, you have some different options. So you can either park yourself at one station and students could move to you so that all of these stations are independent workstations of some kind, and this is your direct instruction station. Or as the teacher, you could float. So you could essentially move around to each of the different stations and support students, okay? Now let's look at what this would actually look like in a real model. So let's say that we're teaching math and you need to have students practicing fraction problems. You might open class by still having a whole group activity that's, again, in some type of digital workspace. Padlet will work for this as well, where you're going to have them all practice fraction problems as a whole group. And then you're going to set up these stations, which again, maybe are all students together, or you have mixed groups of students who are remote and students who are in person, or you do this where you actually have students do stations, but they are sitting at an individual desk if you're not allowed to group students. And the way that that would work is you would essentially time these, and then you would let students know, okay, move to your next station, and they would do that, but they would be doing that at their own desk. So what you might do for these stations, you might have one setup where it's a personalized learning station. So here you might have students on a program like ST Math, like IXL, where they're just moving through some math problems that are practicing math at their own pace. And regardless of the subject you teach, having some element of this personalized adaptive instruction is really important for differentiating instruction, meeting students at their level. Doesn't matter if we're doing fully in person, remote, blended, building in some personalized learning is an important part of the day. Then you could have, for the actual grade level content, the work that you're doing that day, you could do something like a Nearpod self-paced fractions lesson. So that's not too dissimilar, right, from some of what we talked about with the vertical plan. It's just that students will be doing that on their own in a self-paced lesson. And then you could also have a different station where you're doing some gamified learning. So if you are a math teacher, a game like Prodigy is a fun game. It's free that students like to play. That's also adaptive, so it's also personalized. And so each of these are essentially activities that students can really just do on their own, right? And then again, one option, if you're using this kind of park the teacher in a station idea, is that when you either rotate to the group or students rotate to you, that's where they're getting some small group instruction. So that's going to be a lot more feasible if you say even have, you want to do some live instruction, and even if you want to have it where on your end it's not tech based, you're doing something on a whiteboard or behind you or a mini whiteboard, you could do that. You could do that in front of just a handful of computers or in front of a physical group of students or a mix of those students and then students on computers. And then after that station's rotation is done, you can have students all still move into a type of independent activity, potentially collaboration, if you're able to do collaboration, where they're working on some application of that knowledge, say doing something like making a fractions recipe digital book or something like that. Then you could close out the lesson with a whole group checkout. Now, I know I just want to show really quickly, I mentioned Prodigy. So Prodigy is this really cool game. And one of the reasons why I want to show this now is because there are actually a lot of games that are like this. So this, it has all this music. I'm going to turn the music off that doesn't play here, but you'll see it's very engrossing. So students can basically play this role-playing game. Looks a lot like Zelda, and might be hearing that come through the mic. The idea is that, students are playing this character. They get to even pick what the character looks like, pick the character's name. They proceed through this whole game. And what they're doing in here is answering math problems, and the game starts to learn their level. So it becomes adaptive. And they, play this role playing game. So these types of activities, are activities that students can do entirely on their own, and they're building skills in a really fun, engaging way for students, right? So here, now we can see that this is where they're actually having to do some math practice. Now, if this type of thing is interesting to you to figure out how might I set up one of the stations to be a game, I would recommend that you go to Common Sense. I know I've mentioned this on some live shows before. Common Sense Education has EdTech reviews, and if you search games, you'll see all kinds of games. You can see which ones are free if you teach on tablets, which ones are for iPads or Android tablets. And there's all kinds of games that you can set up that are educational. A lot of them are adaptive now, so they're going to be directed right at students' level. And that could be a really effective station to put together that students could do, again, at home, or that students could be working on if they were physically in the classroom with you. Now, the last one that I want to show here is how you could set up your classroom to be self-paced for a group of students in the class. And this is going to be a much larger group of students. And then also deliver some small group instruction or flexible support. So you may have heard of flexible teaching. Flexible teaching is essentially the idea that students can move in and out of a small group for support if they need it. And so, what that would look like is that you have all of the students set up on some self paced lessons. And I believe that the best way to do this is by constructing a hyperdoc, which I'll show in a moment. And all of these different programs would be really ideal for this type of self-paced lesson. Now, again, this goes back to that idea that I mentioned in the beginning about really emphasizing lesson design. So if you spend a lot of time up front, you really focus on constructing a meaningful, well-sequenced lesson that puts together some different programs in intentional ways. You could have students go through an entire lesson sequence essentially on their own. They could either come over to you in a small group that you determine. So you could pull small groups to do some review of some drafts that they're working on or do some skill building in that small group. Or you could have that small group be flex support so that if students need some support, they essentially are able to either physically come over to you or using one of the programs be able to request help. And actually, that's something I forgot to mention with a lot of these programs like ClassKick and Whiteboard Chat, is that students can raise digital hands, things like that, to show you as the teacher that a student needs help. So that's why those programs were able to have those digital workspaces are really useful for this. Now, some of these programs already mentioned where you're going to essentially have students move through lessons and engage in some interactive content. I showed an example of that with Nearpod, which again, you could have students proceed through on their own or do it live. In this case, it would obviously be self-paced. Some people I've seen in the chat have been mentioning Pear Deck. Pear Deck would be a good option for this as well. And then you can also start to build all this interactive content. Actively Learn is great for interactive websites and articles and videos. Edpuzzle, as you probably know, a great program for interactive videos. You can make tutorials, which I know we all know about now with Screencastify Loom, where you're giving instruction, you're actually uploading it into a program like Edpuzzle to make it interactive. And students are not only learning from your instruction, but they're also getting little checks for understanding embedded in that video because you uploaded it into Edpuzzle or Nearpod and made it interactive. And then when it gets to having students apply what they've learned, these programs, I mentioned Canva before, and I did my show about Canva last week, really great programs for having students apply learning in creative, meaningful, engrossing ways. And again, if you build out something like a hyperdoc, you can have students do that essentially entirely on their own at their own pace, because you would be strategically putting in some tutorials for them to learn how to use those programs. Again, if they need help, they jump over to get that flex support, or maybe you're teaching them some skills over here as well. Flipgrid, as we know, can be effective for that, for having students make videos to share what they've learned via video. I think particularly a good idea if you have a lot of students doing remote instruction, can help them feel connected. And making videos is also something that's sometimes easier to do actually remotely. And quizzes, Gimkit are also other types of gamified learning, other ways that you can have students engage in engrossing, exciting games to practice what they've learned. Now, I want to show an example of a hyperdoc here that I used with my students and did exactly this essentially. And what we did was when I taught this hyperdoc was a flex model, except we were fully remote. So essentially I did a whole group kickoff, quick whole group kickoff, where we all normed on what essentially where we were and what needed to happen. I gave some direct instruction. Then students moved into some self-paced work on their hyperdoc, and the ultimate product was that they were using Soundtrap to make a podcast, which we eventually published to our class website that got published to the whole school. And then we had flex support. Now, all this flex support was happening remotely at the time, but we essentially had office hours, and some students were required to come if we noticed that they were falling behind, or students could just come and stay right after our whole group meeting to get some additional support. So you can still implement this kind of flex help, even if you're fully remote. So what something like this might look like is that you have essentially pre-set up this entire lesson. And I'll make sure, oh, but if you, this is a good note, if you sign up for my mailing list, this is one of the resources you can get as a free lesson or free resource for signing up, is this self-contained hyperdoc about how to basically go from almost knowing nothing about podcasting to publishing a podcast. And again, this is designed so that a student can move through this essentially at their own pace, and you can give them all the pieces of a lesson like this up front, and they can go, right? Sometimes I hear people saying, well, what if they move far ahead? And I know sometimes I've had that fear in the past, like, what if they're moving too far ahead? I mean, if they're moving too far ahead, then we can give them some other challenge activities. That shouldn't be too much of a concern. I would give it to them and see what they can do. So you can see here that students are given a type of engage question. They're going to answer what they already know about a podcast. And then I'm going to start to use this hyperdoc to push them out to other links. So they're going to start poking around, listening to a couple of sample podcasts. And this particular podcast, the topic was, this was right after we went into shelter in place. So they were going to do a podcast, either interviewing a family member or just a monologue about their experience. And at the time, KQED had just released a student podcast with some high schoolers on this topic. And so they listened to that, and we just narrowed down closer and closer to the actual subject matter that they were learning about, so that they could learn and see an example of what their final example would look like. They took notes about what they learned, and then they started to build their topic, right? So I'm giving them some sentence starters. And these also, by the way, were different things that I was explaining, say, as the kickoff for the beginning of the lesson. So it's not that it was entirely on their own. We took, a little bit of time to explain this so that they knew what they were doing. And then basically students just went through, they followed these different links to other websites that gave them some guidance for how to compose the podcast, watched tutorials about how to get high quality audio recordings. And then we had different tutorials in here teaching them how to actually record it, how to edit their podcasts in Soundtrap, all the way through the process of titling it, giving it a brief description, even creating a graphic design for it, and eventually publishing their podcast. So this type of lesson is obviously something where you have a much greater emphasis on lesson design. You have to do a lot of upfront planning, but then once you explain it to kids, you can mostly let it run as a self-paced lesson, and then use this model to either strategically pull the groups. So you could pull them to give them feedback about their drafts, for example, before they actually record, or just open yourself up, right, to be able to provide support. So those are three models that I think we could potentially even shift back and forth between when we're thinking about how do we address this issue of needing to teach students who are coming in remotely, students who are physically in the classroom. So again, we could continue to use our vertical planning model. In this case, we're going to want to have students all on one-to-one devices. We are going to pace the lesson together. We're going to use programs that ideally allow us some visibility so that we can see what's going on. Nearpod will give us those immediate reports. ClassKick, Formative, Whiteboard Whiteboard Chat all allow us to pace that lesson, see those student boards, give feedback in those student boards. So rather than being up, say, lecturing, I'm still teaching from my computer. In some ways, maybe similarly to how you might teach if you're fully remote, right? And then the other option is to do this horizontal planning where it's no longer linear planning. Instead, you're thinking about how you can break students up into strategic groups. You're either moving around between those groups or you're parked at one group. And most of those groups, unless you're there, are going to be some sort of self-paced learning as well. And again, I did also mention that those groups could potentially just be, or they could potentially be stations that happen as an individual. So if you are in a situation where you can't group students, I know that some people are in that situation, understandably, then you can still move students through stations, or give them even choice for which stations they would move through. You can still do stations even without having students be in groups or actually physically moving. And then the last strategy is this self-paced learning for a large majority of the class, if not the entire class. And then you're providing flex support, or you're strategically pulling groups while the rest of the class works on a self-paced lesson that you've designed, ideally doing something like a hyperdoc and making sure that you have interactive pieces, that you have some higher application of learning with some of these creativity apps. If you're going to do more typical assessments, you still make those fun with quizzes and Gimkit and things like that. All right, so I am going to jump into the Q&A, and I see that there are a lot of people who have dropped in some different comments and questions. And if you do have a question, you asked one earlier, and you want to drop it in now, then I can try to get to it, so it's a little bit easier to see if you put it in now. Okay, why is that? Let's see here. Try to figure out what's going on with that background. 1 second. Okay, so this question is about whether or not I have built a hyperdoc in whiteboard chat. So yes, you can essentially build a hyperdoc in whiteboard chat. You could also build a hyperdoc in a program like Wakelet or Google Slides, Google Docs. So you kind of saw what I did here, where I had built out the lesson where I was pushing students essentially to do different activities, and even potentially doing things like embedding videos into whiteboard chat, or embedding things like you can also bring in websites as well. So you can really, build essentially very similar experience to a hyperdoc in here as well. Really, the most important thing with a hyperdoc, it's not that it is pushing students out to a lot of different programs, is that it's an intentionally sequenced lesson. So yes, I think you can do that in whiteboard chat. You just got to be a little bit creative about it. Okay, let's see. Next question I have. So this question about how to support students who are falling behind on a WhatsApp platform. So I'm actually not that familiar, Rose, with teaching through WhatsApp. If you could just clarify, then maybe I can help you with that question. Okay, so this question, Bonnie, thank you. Need ideas for a small group when you need to social distance. How do you physically do it with in-person kids? I guess it depends on whether or not, so what the physical distance looks like. And in the case, I'm going to assume that you might be able to still have groups, but they need to be further apart potentially. I would make the group work less reliant on maybe verbal conversation and more on interacting in these platforms. So there are lots of programs where they can get in there, right? And they're able to, oh, sorry about that. That was my Prodigy game music. I apologize for that. That was playing in the background. Thank you for, for letting me know. That's the beauty of Prodigy game. Okay, sorry about that. Yes, it really depends. It's going to depend on how far apart students need to be. And you can still virtually group students. So with all these programs, you can virtually group them. They don't necessarily need to be physically together in a group. So something to keep in mind. You may also have to have the groups be, say, smaller groups potentially. And like in this model, you may only be able to, you may set this up and then your group might just have to be two kids that are kind of far apart from one another. So it's going to depend on exactly how many students are in your class and what the space is like. Obviously, going to depend pretty dramatically for different situations. Okay. What other games are available besides quizzes and Prodigy? So actually one that I really like that I talk about in my top tech tools for teachers in 2021 is GimKit. And GimKit, it works similarly to quizzes and Kahoot in that you have questions and you have answers. But the difference is that it turns it into a game that's a little bit more like Prodigy. It's less sort of like a character moving through a space, but much more engrossing and involved than some of those other quiz games. And there are lots of different game choices that you can choose from. And they also have pre-made questions and answers. So there's all kinds of stuff about different subjects that you might teach. So definitely worth checking out GimKit. And again, I do show GimKit in that video that I showed in the beginning, my top tech tools for teachers in 2021. Yeah, I'll have to check this out. Bloomer. I have not heard of Bloomer, but thank you. I will definitely look into Bloomer. And yeah, sorry. And thanks. Got your fix there. It's no problem. I'm making mistakes all the time. We're all doing it. So not a big deal at all. But so yeah, I will check out Block. Okay. I have heard of is it BlueKit or Blockit? I'm not actually sure. I've heard of it, but I'm not familiar with it. So we'll check it out. Thank you for the recommendation. And Patricia, if you also want to drop in the chat for others, what that game is about, that would be awesome if it's for a particular subject. Okay, so this is a great question as well. This is about a smartboard. So how to best use a smartboard in a hybrid synchronous setting. So my assumption with the smartboard is that you're still able to project, it's not an assumption. You're able to project whatever it is that you have on your computer onto the smartboard. So for example, if you are using a program like Jamboard, Whiteboard Chat, Nearpod, you can project that onto the smartboard. So I would look at that as that's the tool for students that are in person to be able to see that smartboard. But I would de-emphasize the smartboard, the physical smartboard, and I would emphasize the online whiteboard, the online smartboard essentially. Use that as your primary tool so that the students who are remote aren't dependent on trying to look through the camera and see what you're doing on the smartboard. And the other thing about that is that they likely won't be able to interact with it, right? So if they can't interact with it, then you need to think about whether or not it's useful to use. If they can interact with it, then you might want to show them the physical whiteboard. But I would de-emphasize the physical one and emphasize the virtual whiteboard spaces. Yeah, this is a great question. One I've been thinking about as well. Thank you, Erica, about tools to learn English as a second language. So, a lot of the tools that people use for interactivity, for accessibility are very much applicable to learning a language, right? Flipgrid could be a great example of actively practicing speaking a language. It doesn't, have to be remote or hybrid. Would be a great option for in-person learning, just because there's so few really ways or opportunities for students to be practicing the speaking and listening standards, and particularly important if they're learning a language. So Flipgrid is a great program for that. If you need students to learn, read and learn about English, through reading texts, Actively Learn is really effective for that because the text is fully interactive, so they can get definitions, they can translate words. It helps make the reading more accessible. But any of the tools that have students share in different ways, I think are also good for language building. Those are sort of general tools in terms of just functionality. But again, like I showed before, I would also definitely check out Common Sense. So, you know, search in the search box for what you're looking for, and you're going to also find here some content specific tools that would apply for you and for your content area that you know other people might not know about who don't teach that content area. So definitely would check that out. Yeah, Brain Pop. Thanks for the suggestion. Yeah, different. Brain Pop is a great program. There's going to be lots of programs like Brain Pop, Flocabulary, different engaging videos. But the whole idea is just that's visual content, right? And that's something you can get with Edpuzzle. Just make sure well, with Edpuzzle, obviously it's going to do this, but you're embedding some questions in there. So rather than say having them watch a video and just answer comprehension questions, they could answer questions pertaining to language. So you can really make those programs, I think, work for really any content area. Yes, definitely, Kathy. So HyperDoc lessons that are already designed, absolutely. So actually, if you go to hyperdocs.co, which I will put, and it's not com, it's .co, and I'll put that here. That is the HyperDocs website, and their whole thing is teachers give teachers. So they have loads of free lessons on there and archives of HyperDocs. If you also sign up for my mailing list, I have a bunch of free HyperDocs that I give away as well. That's in the video description. But yeah, hyperdocs.co, all subject areas. They basically will give you access to like a Google Drive where you can download a bunch of different HyperDocs. So check them out. All right. So Janet, thank you. Best app for high school ELA arts, remote learning, live streaming, teaching in the classroom at the same time. This is a tough question. I hesitate to say best apps for anything. I'm excited about a lot of programs. I do really like a lot of the activities that they have in Canva Education now. You can make any worksheet in Canva Education interactive, and they have a lot of higher level ELA type worksheets in there. Now, of course, if you're looking more for like reading type resources, Newsela is an amazing resource for ELA, as is Actively Learn, which allows you to make any text interactive. I just put out a tutorial about Actively Learn on the channel that you might want to check out. And thanks, Eric. Yeah, appreciate it. Finally hit my one video, million views about Google Jamboard. If you haven't checked that one out, definitely check that out. I appreciate it, Eric. Thank you. All right. So still have a few minutes to answer questions. I know that a lot of people, I've put some questions up top, but there are lots of comments today. So if you have a question that you want me to get to, then please make sure you drop it in now. Purpose games as well. Yeah, there's so many. Thanks, Patricia. I got to check out some of these games you're recommending. There's so many awesome games. And yeah, I think gamifying learning, particularly this time of the year, is such a great way to kind of re-engage students and get them interested. And it's a really effective activity to have students do for independent learning, in one of these models we're talking about, where you need to have students just kind of working on their own on something engrossing, so you can pull a smaller group and be able to effectively teach those students, who are mixed remote, mixed in person. And yeah, Educa Play as well, definitely. Yeah, so thanks, Rose. Oops, sorry, thanks, Rose. I'm not familiar. Thanks for the recommendation with live worksheets. I'm assuming it, if allows you to make a worksheet interactive, works in a similar way to what I showed last week in the show with Canva Education, where you can lock certain boxes, kind of like a master slides, and then have students just fill in particular parts or make drag and drop worksheets and things like that. So those are really good ideas or good options as well. If you have a collaborative group of students, some of them are, you could have, particularly this issue where you can't have a physical group because of social distancing. Well, you could have a group where one of the kids is in in person, one of the kids is remote, but they're collaborating on an interactive worksheet, maybe doing a project planner and something like that, and then ultimately doing a project. They could do that all in a hybrid situation where they're never actually face to face. Lot of different ideas for digitizing worksheets and things like that. I appreciate that. And you're welcome, Karen, for drawing on Google Slides. Yeah, I actually used the annotate extension briefly in the show. If you're not familiar with that, would recommend you check that out. I also have a video about that, about how to draw on Google Slides. It's a cool extension. And yes, ClassKick. So ClassKick is one of the ones that I referred to in the beginning of the show when I was talking about some different programs here that would be good, particularly if we want to kind of continue this vertical planning model and be able to see workspaces. ClassKick is really effective for being able to jump in, give students feedback, also pair students up so they can actually give each other feedback, create drag and drop worksheets, things like that. So yeah, very much like ClassKick. Yeah, this is a problem, thanks Kathy, that a lot of people are having right now. The extension is not working, or it's no longer available, as a lot of people have found. Try hitting Command or Control minus. I know that's not the best solution, but it's at least going to change your screen so that you should be able to see more students. But I know that that's not always the most ideal. But yeah, go try Command or Control minus when you're on the screen. That should change the dimension of the screen so that you can see them a little bit better. Yeah, thanks, Avril, for the question about noise. So yeah, in fact, in general, it's a great question, because this is like the logistics issue that you really got to deal with. In general, you want students who are working on computers to have headphones, because they're going to be watching videos and doing all kinds of things. It really doesn't work that well without headphones. So we actually had some really cheap, just ear over headphones that plugged into the computer. But I always ask students if they had them to bring their own headphones. Most students do, but something that your school might need to invest in for sure. Definitely need headphones. Now, microphones, yes, Avril, if you can get them to have headsets with microphones, that's also better. Particularly, I'm sure a lot of us, if you use programs like Flipgrid, you're going to find doesn't actually pick up the sound all that well from the computer, especially if you're just using a Chromebook, and sometimes students don't talk loudly, but then if they do talk loudly, it picks up in everybody else's computer. So if you could get headsets with microphones, that would be ideal. So I don't recommend as much that the teachers are necessarily miking themselves up and live streaming and things like that. I'm not convinced that that's the most effective way to deal with this situation, but I do think having students have the headphones and microphones is a good solution for sure. All right. Thanks, Karen. Yeah, for the recommendation for the course as well. I really appreciate it. All right, everybody, it is 5 o'clock. Thank you so much for the engagement and for the questions. If you have not yet signed up for my weekly newsletter, there's a link in the video description that will give you access to 20 plus free resources. And you'll also get email updates about events and live shows and videos that I post. So check that out in the video description below. And I will see you next week. A lot of people in today's show were expressing interest in gamified learning. Next week's show is going to be about gamified learning. So I'm excited to present some of these different tools. And I got some different ideas in today's show from some of the participants for different game tools to look into. So thank you very much. Shout out Patricia for giving me a lot of those ideas. I will definitely check them out ahead of next week's show. All right, everybody, have a great evening or morning, depending on where you are. Great rest of your week. And I hope to see you next week on the show.